with everything we have going on, and we're looking at the book of Daniel, see how do we live our faith publicly despite a world around us that might not embrace what we embrace. And in the story this morning, this is top 2 famous Bible stories of all time. You can find any atheist in America who's heard the story of the fiery furnace. This morning we're breaking it into 2 parts, going a little slower, and I want to focus in a little bit differently than we normally would. And so to start off, though, I have to talk about my own discomfort, because when I first started dating Caitlin, she didn't know this at the time, I don't think, maybe she did, but I was really, really short until about like 10th, 11th grade, and I talked as much as I already do, but I sound like Alvin from the Chipmunks without helium. It's just the natural pitch and tone. So I was really tiny, and I talked way too much, so I was obviously very popular at school, and everything went well for me at all times. None of that happened. But so as Caitlin and I started dating, I have this thing in the back of my head. I was like, oh, I used to be so short. And then I finally grew to be 6 feet tall. Thank goodness I got out of there. She looks at me like, second time we've hung out as like a dating couple, and she's like, you're the shortest guy I've ever dated. And I'm like, oh, okay. Yeah, taller than you, shorty. And but in thinking through that, I'm like, okay, I had finally attained 6 feet tall. I'd gotten over it. I was so sad to be taken off the volleyball team senior year because I was getting bad grades in Spanish. All I learned is to say I'm sorry, so lo siento, if any of my Spanish teachers are watching this. But the whole problem I ran into was I was finally tall enough to play volleyball well and getting in the court, and then pulled off in my moment to finally have some fun with it. But then as I realized on Friday, I was messing around with medical equipment at a doctor's office, and I either never was 6 feet tall or I shrunk about an inch. So I had to come with the grips really like I may have been lying to myself for years. Because at one point I swear I was 6 feet tall. I may have shrunk, or I may just have been lying this entire time. I'm still taller than you, Nelson. You can look at me like that all day long. Still taller than you. No matter what, I'm always going to be taller. We're going to have that argument after church. All right, but back to the point is, every single one of us, we can fall into some lies we tell ourselves. And they might just be innocent and dumb, like, hey, Matt's actually like an inch shorter than you thought. Or they could be like, hey, I actually caught the fish and it was this big, and you caught like bait fish, and you're just trying to make it sound like you caught a catfish from like 200 years ago. But like the lies can grow and become bigger and bigger. But this morning we're going to look through a very, very familiar passage, but I'm not going to focus on the fact that there's this maniacal dictator that wants the whole country to worship him as some kind of god. I could be very mistaken, but no matter what happens in the United States, I don't think we're going to see that come up on our punch card for whatever happens in the years to come. That has happened very recently in human history, though. If you've lived in China, when Mao came to power, there was a deification of the state and the worship of leaders. There's all these different moments throughout relatively modern history where leaders did come up and say, hey, you got to get rid of all religion. I am the true leader. North Korea, I think they still do something like that, but they don't really text us much from North Korea. But the problem is, in this passage, we will likely never face what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego faced. And since we'll never face that, and this happened so long ago, sometimes we can read a Bible story, and we're just like, okay, there was 3 dudes, something happened, they obeyed God, and they survived the barbecue, and it was all great, and we all go home and pat ourselves on the back. But looking at this story this morning, I want to hone in on the idea of, at the end of the day, Nebuchadnezzar is going to lie to himself and everyone around him. So we're going to open up to Daniel chapter 3, and we're only going to look at the first 18 verses this morning. And you already all have what I have of knowing where the story's going. It's not a surprise that these 3 are living. We're going to sing Another in the Fire at the end of this one, and we're going to talk about the passage next week. We know they survived, so we can start assuming things. But we know that these men have now grown. We don't know exactly how many years it's been, but they're now over the age of 18. They have full-time, very high-up positions in the government. And there's a command that we're going to put on the screen that God gave all of the Israelites. And we're going to get to chapter 9 of Daniel, so we'll know for a fact that these men would have known what God had said for them to do. So if you'll read with me from Jeremiah 29 before we get into Daniel 3, starting in verse 4, this is what the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of Israel, says to all the captives he has exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. Build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Then find spouses for them so that you will have many grandchildren. Multiply, do not dwindle away, and work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare will determine your welfare. That's the marching orders. These 3 young men probably by this point may have gotten married. might have had some kids, but when we just read the story, we're like, 3 dudes, they stood up for God and they went home. But I want you to imagine how hard it would be to give up and risk the fact that you know fully well that you may die and lose your family, lose your children, lose this life that God has told you to build. That'd be a lot harder, right, than just, it's some teenagers, they obeyed God and they went on their way. So as we look at the detail of chapter 3, I want you to keep in your mind that this may be some family men who have stable government jobs and are doing their best to serve the kingdom they're in and the kingdom of God. And so in chapter 3, verse 1, we see that King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and set it up on the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then he sent messages to the high officers, officials, governors, advisors, treasurers, judges, magistrates. You can kind of fall asleep. This list is so long. Every branch of government, every single government employee from the DMV to the Supreme Court is all supposed to show up for this. That all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue he had set up. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And it's a really weird transition because last week we ended on Nebuchadnezzar worshiping God for revealing that God is the ultimate authority and power, that his kingdom is the only one that's going to matter and last. So I think in light of that new information, Nebuchadnezzar has to lie to himself. He has to tell himself, hey, I was the golden head in that dream, so I'm still the best one. I'm the most important. Everyone should worship and follow me and myself and I. And we can be like, what an arrogant fool that he could be so obsessed with himself to build a statue that's 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide and tell everyone to come and worship him. I'm way better than Nebuchadnezzar. I would never put my own interests and delude myself into thinking that something I want to happen is actually good for everybody else, right? We would never, ever possibly be able to deceive ourselves like that. This morning we have the good example of what followers of God will do, but I want us to stop for a moment and question, how much like Nebuchadnezzar do we act? Because my story of how tall I was is a funny introduction, but at the end of the day, we're going to get into what is a lie, what is the truth, and what matters. And the problem we have today is there's only a very small sliver of people left in Western culture that care about objectively true statements. And they're Christian. If you go tell someone, hey, this is the way, the truth, and the life, no man may come to the Father except through Jesus, they say, that's your truth, not my truth. I hope you have a great day. I'm happy that you give to the needy. I really like that clothing drive you guys did, and have a nice week. But that's an option they can take, but if there's only truth versus the lies, I want to read us a brief quote. I often joke nothing good can come out of Russia, but I was wrong. So there's this Russian thinker. I'm not going to try to get his name right. Just know that I'm not Russian, and I apologize if you are. Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I tried my best. But he wrote an essay titled Live Not by Lies, where he tries to bring together Russian people during Soviet violence and oppression. And he says in his essay, oppression demands of us only a submission to lies, a daily participation in deceit, and this suffices as our fealty. And therein we find, neglected by us, the simplest, the most accessible key to our liberation, a personal non-participation in lies. Even if all is covered by lies, even if all is under their rule, let us resist in the smallest way. Let their rule not hold through me. For when people renounce lies, lies simply cease to exist. Like parasites, they can only survive when attached to a person. And that's a really smart Russian guy. My bad for making fun of Russia for so long. Apparently got some really good people. You should check out Tolstoy next. I've heard he's great. But what we want to focus on there is this lie idea. It's a parasite attached to someone, and this is a maniacal dictator who's made it all about himself, denying the reality of God. There's going to be some problems. So then a herald shouted out, people of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harp, pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's golden statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And we don't know for certain based on the text, but I'm willing to bet the face might have looked a lot like Nebuchadnezzar. If you go to the effort of putting up a 90-foot tall gold statue, you might make it look like he. So he is so into his own lie that he is the superior of everything. That it brings us to our first point, that no matter what time we live in, people will always find a lie to replace the truth of God's authority. No matter when you're alive right now, back then, it won't look like this in our lifetime. If I'm wrong, I'll send you a sorry from prison, because I'll be in prison for saying a lot of stuff about Jesus. But if no matter when we're alive, people are going to find lies to replace the truth of God's authority, we can look to today. There's plenty of people who can see a lot of actually pretty solid evidence for believing in a creator God who loved us enough to write himself into the story and come and sacrifice himself to save us. When you look at the issues of the human heart, like we touched on last week, there's never been a point in human history where reliance on human kindness and dignity brought about utopia. The Bible is the best explanation for human nature. It's the best explanation for the created world we see around us. Because even if you disagree on, one of the 80 things that we've argued about for 20 years, if you look at the universe, everything in the universe, it appears to be finely tuned that human beings can live in a specific place and time. And some people just say, well, it's a fallacy to assume that that's correct. A lot of other people are like, well, the Occam's razor is the simplest answer is often the best answer. That is the simplest answer. It looks fine-tuned because it is. If you don't know a lot about engines and you open the hood of your car, it might look a little bit confusing and messy. And if you open my hood, it's really dirty. You've got to wipe a lot of stuff off. But if you know and recognize what the different parts of the engine are, and you try to rip out one of the parts, is the car going to keep working? No, because it was intentionally designed and put together in a way that will produce something valuable. And so if we're going to live in a world now where there's a million good excuses as to why people aren't going to obey God's authority, I'll lead with one theory and we'll get back into the Word. My leading theory for why so many stories in Hollywood and all these modern writers, it's not just postmodernism. It's, if there is no God, I have nowhere to take my guilt and my shame, so I need to go be virtuously championing other people to make their causes something that's celebrated because I feel so terrible about myself, I have to make myself better. And human betterment's a good cause. But if we don't accept God's authority, we have to rely on ourselves to provide that ultimate authority. And that's what he did by lying to himself, building this massive statue and demanding that everyone worship him. As we go on in verse 8, it says, but some of the astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. Nobody likes snitches, right? That kid in the lunchroom is like, oh, Timmy stole his lunch. It's like, shut up. No one likes you. Nobody likes a narc. It's never a good thing. But they go and inform on the Jews. They say to King Nebuchadnezzar, long live the king. You're issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the horn, flute, zither, lyre, harps, pipes, and other musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon. They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. Now we have to get to a call for all of us, and this isn't the point yet. We're still reading. But it's time for a certain group of people to step up and obey God over what they're told to do. I've been fascinated the more I've studied and looked at the early church on their response to the different professions people had. Because there's one or two professions we might think of as Christians. They were like, you might need to quit your job the second you come to Jesus because your job might be messing with people. It might be something evil. It might be something wrong. It might be something morally unjust. But back in the early church, they were figuring it out. They're like, man, we have some of the writings. We have basically the Gospels. We have these church fathers. But even in northern Africa, during the time of a church father named Tertullian, they had a Roman soldier that Tertullian wrote about who became a Christian. And he stayed in the military. But then as they were called to bow down and put on these golden crowns in admonition and recognition of this new emperor's leadership. And as a Christian, he stayed in the military, but he refused to wear the golden crown. And as a result, it sounds like he got beaten to death. Because he said, I can still serve my country, but I will never bow now to another master or king because that is reserved for God alone. So throughout human history, we've seen this problem of people want to be in charge. They want to tell themselves, I know best, everyone shut up, follow my lead, and you'll live a perfect life under my control and my rule. And that's what they were doing. And they reminded the king, hey, you're in charge, you're the best one ever, but these losers over here, that, by the way, you put them in charge of us, we're not too happy about that, but that's a side issue. But they refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up. So then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him. When they were brought in, Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments. But if you refuse, you'll be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace, and then what God will be able to rescue you from my power? Definitely full ride on the ego trip. He knew there was a God who was superior to everything else, because we learned that last week. He admitted it. He bowed before that God, but he still didn't believe, and he had to lie to himself and remind himself, I'm actually better than everyone else, and my authority is all that matters. And in 2024, I'm going to call that culture. Yes, we have a president, we have a justice system, but luckily in our country we have a checks and a balance system. It's not perfect, but I don't want to be anywhere else. I'm thankful for it. But right now there's no checks and balances. Every member of the government is on board to bow and kneel before one person. And in the United States, the closest thing we have is the big C culture. There's the culture you grow up in. There's a small town in the South that we live in, but there's this bigger culture. And now, thanks to the internet, any child with a smartphone will grow up far more like someone in New York City than someone in Tullahoma, Tennessee. The cultural barriers of where children are growing up are quickly disappearing. And I'm not saying that to panic you and ban cell phones and all these other things. I'm saying it to remind us that the culture we're in will shape us and mold us. And it will give us blind spots. It will give us barriers to the gospel. No matter where you live, there's going to be some part of it that you really love. Another part when you read it, you're like, I don't like this as much as I thought I was going to. And so this morning, I want to remind us, if you were there was about 36 of us in a living room, and we all agreed, hey, let's do a church plant together. And it's almost been so over the year and a half, we officially became a church family together. I led with, though, hey, let's all be uncomfortable together. The past couple weeks have been rather encouraging of, hey, let's trust the God that we can talk to who knows all the things. But this morning I want to get uncomfortable with all of you because we live in a culture where lying is the same as breathing. I'm not getting political. I just have to mention a politician to explain my argument. There was this guy named Bill Clinton, became president of the United States, and if you were alive for his impeachment, why was he impeached? It was for lying. Now you watch any debate, any news station, and you got to go have your phone out and watch someone in real time fact check what they're saying because everyone is just breathing out lies, and it's not just the political world. If you watch reality TV, I'm not making fun of you. I just make fun of reality TV. Deal? Okay, perfect. So reality TV is to showcase how evil people can be to each other. And you want to see them do the backbiting. You want to see them lie and slander and get away with it and watch people build things up and break things down through how they treat one another. And that's the appeal of it because we're like, oh, I'm not as bad as them, thank goodness. And oh, Stephanie did that to who? Oh my goodness, did you watch last night's episode? Because we can be enraptured by people who are living and breathing lies. And if you're like me or Jennifer Lawrence, you grew up lying your butt off. Once in an interview, she's like, why are you so good at, she was asked why was she so good at acting, and she's like, I just lied a lot as a kid. And so I lied my butt off as a kid. My parents washed my mouth out with soap, not because I said bad words, because it was to teach me, hey, lying is bad. And when you lie, there's going to be consequences involving the tongue. We're not going to get into James today, but there's this book of the Bible that's really short and beautiful about the one thing we can't control is how we speak. Even Mark Zuckerberg had to get on some panel and admit publicly that, hey, maybe we did censor a lot of stuff. Our bad. Maybe we did silence people during certain times because we were instructed to by different government officials. That's how normal lying is. You cannot tell me a place in the world, especially in Western culture, where we're not living and breathing in the lies. And so the point I want to make here is, as they have this outside pressure from these people saying, hey, did you hear these losers over here aren't obeying your commands? And then they get brought before the king. He's saying, bow before my demands. Accept the lie instead of the truth. So our second point this morning is cultural lies demand complicit Christians. And that's where we get a little bit uncomfortable. Because if this Russian guy is right, that lies are parasites that only exist as long as people keep believing them and spreading them and saying them, because once there's no more, like if we all died, the truth is still the same. But the lies we tell are gone. That's why so many people now, it's been heartbreaking to see these people we've respected in the faith, they pass away and then something comes out about them and we're heartbroken and so confused. How could someone who appeared to be following Jesus so well be doing something so evil behind closed doors? There's nowhere in America I can find where the lying hasn't permeated the culture. And if cultural lies demand complicit Christians, we have the same call that this Russian man made, to live not by lies. And I'm harping on this point because at the end of the day, we all tell ourselves lies. Some of us lie about things. Some people will lie about their taxes. There's a million things you could lie about. But if cultural lies demand complicit Christians, there should be a difference. There should be a group of people who believe this is the true word of God. Jesus, as one author pointed out, was either a liar, a lunatic, or who he said he was. And we can know he's not a liar because at a certain point, if you're threatening to kill someone, they're eventually like the sniveling coward who says, all right, fine, I'll back off. I'll admit my lies are false. And we know he's not crazy because everything he said actually happened. Everything he did was seen by witnesses. He rose from the dead, and over 1,000 people saw him in the flesh after they watched the Romans kill him. And if that's true, that part of it should be the root of everything we live and breathe, the truth of who God is, his Son sent for us, and we shouldn't really be known for lies. And I talked to someone a long time ago, and it was one of the last things I should have said on social media, but I keep doing it now. Hopefully it's just pictures of my kid. But I was talking with a man, he posted something, it was a quote attributed to Abraham Lincoln or something. It was a great quote. It was inspiring, it was well thought out. Abraham Lincoln never said such a thing. And I said, hey, just as a heads up, like, good quote, but Abraham Lincoln did not say that. Like, let's just be honest about who said it. He's like, well, it feels true, so I'm just going to leave it up. And I said, hey, like, I'm not trying to be rude, but like, we're not called to feel what's true, we're called to proclaim what's true. And so even if that guy made a good point, we don't know what guy that was, so let's just take Abraham Lincoln off the tag and give it a little bit less credibility. And it was actually amicable. He's like, hey, that's a good point. It was the last time I ever had a good argument on the internet, 10 years ago. But the point I want to get at, though, is that's what Christians should be known for. And a church is a hospital. It's a place where hurting people come together, and we all have sins and flaws. We are all broken people, and the only thing we have to proclaim is Christ and him crucified because he changes who we are. And so some of us might tell the lies because they're not that big a deal, and they're not hurting anybody. We all have these little self-justifications. But if we recognize that we're in a very different time and circumstance, the demand from culture to accept and embrace lies is about as the same pressure as they have before them in this moment. You can either shut up, sit down, and do what the culture is saying, or you can die for it. But this is often a sermon on idolatry. But aside from those several heads over by the railroad in town, I have yet to see any like statues in town that people are like going to see. I went and see them. It's around the corner. They're fun. But there's no one today, unless you're going, I believe there's statues in Buddhist temples. I haven't been to one in a long time. But it's not really normal. If you walk into someone's house, you're not going to see like a statue of some figure that they bow before every single day. It's becoming less and less common. But Charles Spurgeon was pretty smart, and I think if we're going to talk a little bit about the idol in the room that's 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, he once said to his congregation in England, if your goal in life is anything less than the glory of God, you are a worshiper of idols. Which is that's pretty harsh. And it's true, though. I was once hanging out with a friend I had made. I was in this town for about 2 or 3 months, so I just started going to that church, that youth group, and their worship leader was about my age, so we just started hanging out together, going surfing, and he also played World of Warcraft when the cool kids did. I still play. I'm broken. Back when like all the popular kids were playing, and so he wrote a song about hitting level 60 in World of Warcraft, and we were all laughing about it because he sang it at youth group. But he was a very talented worship leader. And I remember he said something almost identical to Spurgeon. We're sitting on the couch in his house. He's like, man, I realize with music, no matter what I'm doing, if it's not glorifying God, I'm glorifying myself. I was like, that's it. I can't argue with that. That's actually kind of frustrating because I do a lot of things when I wake up every day to glorify myself. But as they go on, they have this demand of death. We already know they're going to be saved, but let's read their response to this threat. They're demanded that they embrace these idols. They deny God because obviously their God cannot rescue them from this king's power. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. Be smarter than me. If they didn't need to give answers for everything about their faith to an angry, rage-filled human being, we don't need to either. This person was violently angry, literally, and lying and demanding everyone embrace the lie. And they said, we don't actually have to explain ourselves to you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, that's probably the boldest statement. But even if he doesn't, and I know we all know how this story ends, so we can walk away patting ourselves on the back like, man, they were faithful to God and God saved them. There are hundreds of people a year that say things exactly like this and then instantly get executed across the planet. For belief in Jesus Christ, they get put into modern-day concentration and work camps. There's terrible things happening to believers all over the planet, just not where we get to live. And they say the exact same thing, but even if God doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. That's awesome. That is the correct response. That is inspiring. That is fantastic. They resisted the lies of the culture. They proclaimed who God was. They decided to glorify God even if they were put to death. Because they knew that the world they were living for was outside of their own. But I'm going to do a disservice to all of us if this isn't the last part of the chapter that we read today. And I want us to look at something Jesus said. Because we can read these stories, we can be so excited that God delivered and saved these people out of this terrible situation to show his glory, that you and I can get kind of upset when he doesn't do something similar for us. Because it can be very heartbreaking to live in this world, see things happen, go the wrong way, see people we love go through terrible things, and say, hey God, you were the another in the fire, why am I by myself? And so I want us to look at something Jesus said. In Luke chapter 14, I'm going to swap to ESV for this because I'm a nerd and I'll explain that later. But in the meantime, we're going to put up Luke chapter 14, verses 25 through 33. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned to them and said, he turned and said to them, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Is that the worst marketing pitch you've ever heard in your life for starting a religion? Yeah, that's brutal. And especially the hate. I now have a daughter. I'm a huge fan. My wife is limiting, for a good reason, like she's limiting how much I post of her on social media because she's so crazy awesome. But if I don't hate my wife, my daughter, my brothers, my sisters, my family, I can't be a disciple of Jesus. That's pretty intense language. But if we look back to this story of this lying guy who became the nation of Israel, he lied a whole lot. His life was defined by lies. God tried to teach him lessons through the lies, and he still kept lying. But eventually he wrestled with God and became renamed Israel. But in that story, he marries two women. And yes, polygamy is in the Bible, but it doesn't sound like it went very well. The Bible often shares things it does not endorse. But in the story, it says in ours, well, Jacob loved Rachel more than he loved Leah. And in English, that makes sense, right? Like, you're always going to have a favorite. You can't tell which kid it is, but like, we know. But deep down, that we know there's degrees of love. But in the original Hebrew text, it does not say that he liked one more than the other. It said Rachel he loved and Leah he hated. Because when the Hebrew language existed, it evolved over time into many different languages. The Tower of Babel is involved in all sorts of things. But long story short, we have a lot more words now. Back then, they had two. You either hated someone or you loved them. There was no in between. And that's the point Jesus is making. Unless you are willing to give every single thing to me above everything else, you cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. That's not only do you need to put that above everything else that you love and cherish in your life, above anything else that you want for your own glory, you also need to be willing to go to the point of a torturous death in following Jesus. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete? So my dad's building a house right now, and it'd look pretty funny if in 5 years it's still the green house because there's just siding on it and there's not enough money to finish the house, right? Jesus is using the same thing. Nowadays, we don't build towers. So imagine you're building a house. It's pretty funny. The neighbors will chuckle when you're like, wow, there's just a trash bag where that window's supposed to be because you ran out of money. The world we live in. Ever since America's Funniest Home Videos, we found it's very funny to laugh at people falling down. We haven't stopped since. And I can't help it. It's funny. But as we look at what Jesus says, you're going to count the cost first. Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him. It turns out it was before America's Funniest Home Videos. Anyone would always do this, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation, asks for terms of peace. So therefore, any one of you who does not renounce all that he has cannot be my disciple. The most first time at church Sunday ever. But this is what Jesus is calling us to do. And exactly as they responded, and this is our third point, there is always a real cost to following God. There are beautiful gifts from God, whether or not you are a follower of him, because he loves all of his creation and desperately longs for them to come to him. But there is always a real cost to following God. But it's worth it. We're going to get into the later portions of Daniel. We're going to finish, I believe, on December 8th and then get into the Christmas season in spirit as fast as possible. But as we get later and later in Daniel, we're going to see crazier and crazier things and have an affirmation and a comfort that this is a cost to following him. But not only does he return and win, he is the judge of all the wrongs that have been committed and gotten away with. So that means those people that have hurt you and wronged you and done things to you and gotten away with it, there is justice. There is a promise of hope. But if we know that the world around us, people are always going to lie and find a lie to replace the truth of God's authority, and the cultural lies will demand complicit Christians, and we know that there's a real cost to following our God, our big idea this morning is, despite the lies of our day and every day to come, because I don't think anyone's going to stop lying anytime soon. Postmodernism won out. Relativism is here to stay. We're now postmodernism, and whatever they develop, I'll let you know in 10 years when they give that a name. But we are called to consider the cost and decide if we will glorify God. Because I want to bring us back to that quote from Spurgeon. If your goal in life is anything less than the glory of God, you are a worshiper of idols. So that means that it's frustrating right now. It's going to be frustrating next year. It was frustrating thousands of years ago. But despite all of that, even when Jesus came, he warned us and said, hey, there is a cost. He tells us later in the gospel accounts what some of that looks like. But the hope that we have, the hope that we keep our eyes on, is the truth of who Christ is. And I'm harping on us as a church, not because I think we've all been lying lately. No one has texted me saying, oh, someone lied about me and I'm mad about it. I'm harping in on it because as we see this king demand through lies of his own devising about himself to feel better about himself, the entire culture shifts to demand everyone in the culture support the lie. 3 people said, we're not going to do that. And as we're going to see next week, it glorified God a whole lot. But what we need to see is today, yes, this is a place for hurting and sick people. When you check into the hospital, they tend to say, hey, we want to have you out by such and such a date. And that doesn't mean when you come to this church, we'll tell you, hey, by October, find a new one. Get out of here. But if it's rehabilitation, God is in the business of restoring broken hearts and broken relationships. The way we should start living in light of the gospel should start looking different than the person we were yesterday. And even if you've been a Christian for 45 years or 85 years or 10 minutes, it is a constant process. And we have a big church word for it. They use a lot in the New Testament. It's called sanctification. It's being made more like God. And not in that you get magic powers and you're in charge, but in the heart and nature of who God truly is. And so if we live in a culture today, just like then, where everyone is accepting and buying into lies, we should be known as people that live not by lies. Because despite the lies of our day and every day to come, we are called to consider the cost and decide if we will glorify God. And again, we're not going to live through the persecution that they had to live through. We're not going to live through a man erecting a statue or a woman erecting a statue and saying, I'm God now in the United States, worship and follow me instead. But that's where the world is headed before Jesus comes back. At some point in human history, as you'll see in 1 Thessalonians and Daniel and Revelation, all of it together paints a picture of someone coming along and saying, hey, I'm a man and I'm God. Follow me instead, and it's way better for you. And so as we head into whatever that future holds, in the meantime, no matter how big or small the lies are, my call for all of us this morning is, pray as Daniel did. Search me, O God. I add in the word tenderly. Sometimes, have you ever searched for something in your house, looked around the house, and found a bigger mess than when you started? I ask that God gently expose those areas of my life, whether or not it's I've shrunk an inch or I lied to myself for years that I was 6 feet tall. Whatever that truth may be, I'm going to ask God continually to help me start living in a way that I don't accept any lies, whether I've come up with them myself or the culture tells me they're true. And I can promise you, whether or not you're the best Christian in the room or the worst Christian in the room or not even a follower of Jesus, all of us have different lies that we've bought into. So we're going to ask God in prayer and then worship him, because as we're going to see next week, there is another in the fire, and our hope is not within ourselves. It's within the God that came down and put his Spirit within himself, or within ourselves. So let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, thank you so much for these fantastic stories that have captured the minds of us as children and the world over. But thank you, Lord, that these are not merely stories invented to teach a moral lesson or bring about some kind of social change. But thank you that these are a beautiful account of the truth of your power intervening in the human history and world around us. So, Lord, we ask you today, please tenderly search our hearts. Please help open our eyes to these areas we've been blinded to by ourselves, through the culture around us. Let us return repeatedly to the truth of who you are, who you have called us to be, and through the Spirit you've given us, enable us to change to become. Lord, thank you for saving us, but please let us not rest on the comfort of the future with heaven with you, but in the future that we right now are changing to look more and more like you. So even though we might be rough around the edges, there's small glimmers of who you are as we interact with those around us, from our one life, the people in our family, to our coworkers, and everyone in between, Lord. Please search us, lovingly remove the blinders from our eyes, and let us live no lies in the truth of who you are. In Jesus' name, amen.